So what have you been doing lately? Working and working and working and working?
Working next week, starting Monday. I go back to work Sunday nights.
You woke up at what, 8 this morning?
Right.
And then you cleaned up your apartment really nicely so you could show us what it looks like?
Yeah, I want you to come over if you feel like it. If you feel like it. Come over if you feel like it.
I don't want to ever see my mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I hate you, motherfucker. I hate you. I hate you.
Jeffrey was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 21st, 1960 to Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. His father Lionel was of German and Welsh ancestry, and he was studying at Marquette University to become a doctor in chemistry, so he was a really smart guy. And Jeffrey's mom, on the other hand, was of Norwegian and Irish ancestry, and she had a profession as a teletype machine instructor. Growing up, Jeff's father Lionel had very little time to be with his family, all because, as I told you, he was studying to become a chemist. He was very absent, but when Jeff's father was home, it was said that his wife, Joyce, she always demanded constant attention from him, and that also made it a little bit tough to, have time with his children. Jeff's mother, according to Lionel, was on prescription drugs while pregnant with Jeffrey. She would spasm, her jaws would go sideways, and she was mentally unstable after she gave birth to him. And she had like this mental problem and was depressed most of the time, and that led that she always slept too often. And that had also an effect on Lionel because he often had to call the doctor for her. During her third month as being pregnant, she experienced morning sickness to the degree that it eventually led her to force her resign from her employment as a teletype instructor. Jeffrey recalled his early years of family life as being extremely tense because he would see his mother and father constantly arguing with one another, and sadly on one occasion, Joyce, the mother, had attempted suicide, and she obviously survived, but neither the parents really devoted much time to their son. When Jeffrey was, however, born, he was described as a happy child, very energetic, and an extremely curious toddler, and he was that until the age of 4. Jeff had loved to wrestle, he loved to get together with kids and play with them. He was, in other words, a very outgoing type of kid, but Jeff's mother was kind of distant from whenever the family decided to have family activities, but it was not all bad. There was like good times still. There were times when they would go to parades, festivals, and also regularly visit the zoo, so there were also good times. But at 4 years old, as I told you, when everything changed, that is when Jeff actually had a surgery to fix a double hernia that he had in his head. At that same period of time, having son and father bonding time, Jeff had watched his father collect the bones of small tiny rodents that had died under the house while cleaning out the crawl space under their home. And Jeff, as always, out of curiosity, because he's a very curious child, as I told you before, he observed his dad putting the dead animals inside a metal pail just to collect them all in one place, and when he dropped them inside the metal pail, a sort of loud noise came, and Jeff, being curious as he was, loved hearing those clanky noises. So what he starts to do is that he starts grabbing these small animals himself, and as his father helped him and just put them down too. And it was said that at that kind of time, that was when he began to pin an interest in animals. But it was said later on by Jeff's father that he took it as something very, normal, that like any kid of his age would do, and helping his father out, and no real danger or any indication of any sinister or dark, motive was unveiled. After the hernia surgery that Jeff had when he was 4 years old, he was very subdued and complained a lot about his head hurting, and had asked his mom if his penis was cut off. It was said that after the surgery he had changed a lot, and he just stopped being himself anymore, and he stopped being happy as he usually had been. When Jeffrey started first grade in Hazel Harvey Elementary, he kind of appeared to be unwilling to attend school. He was very kind of scared and sort of petrified. From being a self-assured child once, he was now a kid that was extremely shy, very timid, and a distant boy, because his mother Joyce also mentioned that he was unwilling to attend school as he would often cry when he had to go to school. Jeff's teacher had reported that he was polite, obedient, and he completed all his school tasks, but even though he showed like little interest in them. However, when the teacher was concerned and talked about this to Jeff's parents, Lionel perceived this somber behavior as a response to the sudden change in environment at home, in school, and it was believed that Jeff experienced hard times to deal with, adapting to change. She also noted a deep unhappiness in Jeff and that he did not show any interest in interacting with his peers, or he had no attempt at all to like engage with other people. And when Jeff was on the playground, he would often wander around himself instead of joining his classmates to play. However, after Jeff's father finished his PhD in chemistry, the family moved away to Doylestown, Ohio in 1966, and at this time Joyce, the mother, was actually pregnant with their second child. Giving birth a month later to another baby boy, Jeff's parents allowed Jeff to actually choose the name of his younger brother, and Jeff chose the name David. In 1968, the family then moved away after relocating 3 times before settling down on a nearly 2-acre wooded lot in the town of Bath in Ohio. And it was at this period of time that Jeff's father, Lionel, started to really realize that the previous sociable Jeff was turning shy and a little bit off, like not seeming to have any friends. He became kind of worried to what was wrong with him. One day, having a family dinner as family, they were eating chicken, and Jeff turns around and asks his father what really would happen if the bones of the chicken were to be placed in bleach solution. And Jeff's father obviously was delighted by this question and adored the initiative displayed by Jeff towards what he believed was, a question out of scientific curiosity. And he willingly showed his son how to safely bleach and later preserve animal bones. Remember that time with his father when he helped his father like drop the dead rodents inside the metal pail, and all because he liked the clanky noises? Well, from that point on, a fascination had grown and an interest in animals, but not just animals, but also for dead animals. He started liking animals that were laying on the ground. The friends of Jeff said that he first collected large insects like dragonflies and butterflies, placing them inside of jars, and then he upgraded to start collecting roadkill off the streets. And in Jeff's mind, roadkill, were already dead animals, so why not like just take them home if they were still going to rot and not was even going to take care of them anyways, like no one was gonna just come and pick them, so I just do it the favor and take them myself, he was thinking. So back home in the backyard, there was a tool shed actually that Jeff would go to and dismember the animals. The reason why Jeff did this was out of curiosity. He wanted to know what was inside the animals, and his explanation to his friends was that he only was curious of how all these animals fit together. Sometimes it would stink very badly, so Jeff would have to hide them in their wooded area because he knew he couldn't just leave the stuff in the tool shed all the time, and especially that this would also awaken a lot of questions from his parents' side. This was around the age of 12 or 13 years old when Jeffrey really had started to take this more seriously and collect and experimenting with these animal bodies. There were many animals such as dogs, cats, squirrels, rabbits, moles, and just everything he could like find on the street. This hobby and behavior to look for roadkill became worse when he was in the 9th grade. Jeff had a biology class in school, and they were like given a task to like dissect fetal pigs. And what Jeff does at the end of the class is that he takes the remains of the little pig home and preserve the skeleton of it. From that point on, Jeff grew a serious obsession, a sort of like a fascination of loving to examine the insides of animals according to himself. Repeatedly after coming home from school, Jeff would actually take walks or bike around to just go and look for roadkill. However, Jeff would pick the animal up and he would go home and start to dissect the animal. But at first, it was not sexual pleasure that he was seeking, but rather a sense of power, a sort of like control that he felt according to himself. But then later on, as I told you, it turns sexual and it's really fucked up. On one occasion, Jeffrey had brought a dead dog that he had found, on the side of the road, and that was like hit by a car, and he started cutting it open. He took the head and then he decided to nail the dog's head into a tree. And then he felt the organs with his hands, and then he took the dog's skull, he cleaned it up, and he got all the dog's hair off and stuff, and then he like took it down to the wooded area behind his home, and there he put the skull on a wooded cross. His fascination grew and grew and grew with bones, and it would continue into his adulthood, but eventually moved from animals to human beings. In Revere High School that Jeff went to, he was the school clown. He played clarinet in his first year as a freshman for the school band, and he also played tennis for a while until he quit. And it was said that he was fairly popular amongst his classmates in school for the odd and silly antics that he would do. He also went to the mall once, and there he would like play that he had a speech impediment and that he also was kind of faking seizures. He would play, you know, this clownish guy, and everyone loved him for that, you know, but just in a silly way. That's why by many he was described as a loner and an alcoholic. Yes, during the years, apparently it had started when Jeff was 13 years old, he had developed an alcohol addiction. Many of his classmates said that he would bring beer or whiskey to school. Heading his way to school, he would smuggle the bottles by putting them inside his jacket and, you know, just to not get caught. And then when he would arrive to the school, he would hide the bottles inside the locker, and he would drink before class, during class, and also sometimes after school. Going into puberty at age 14 or 15 years old, that is when Jeff had like discovered that he was homosexual. This obviously meant that another secret was to be kept away from his parents, apart from the drinking, all because he didn't have a good relationship with them. And besides looking at the interviews in 1994, I could understand why Jeff's father wouldn't be supportive towards his son, you know, being gay. You know, he was a conservative, and according to himself, he would take his son to a therapist if he had known that his son was gay. But another reason why Jeff wouldn't tell his parents was also because the, you know, altercations back and forth between his parents, and, you know, as I had before mentioned to you, they didn't have this kind of good relationship with each other, and so Jeff was distant from that, and that also made it, you know, even harder to tell any one of them because he felt kind of very lonely. And now when he discovered that he was gay, he kind of started to fantasize about controlling and submissively control a male partner with violence intermingled with sex. This reoccurring dream he started to get, this kind of fantasy, as he said later on, was that he had met a hitchhiker on the road and somehow he would pick him up and, you know, able to sexually control him. He was kind of scared that it would turn into reality, and Jeff was constantly worried, and he was not knowing how or who to tell. This obviously made him drink more and more just to, you know, avoid these thoughts. This led to a down spiral when it came to Jeff's grades. They were shortly but surely declining, and he wasn't doing well, all because of the constant drinking. During the same period of time, in 1977, his parents' relationship was not getting any better, and in an attempt to save the marriage, they had to counseling a few times, but it didn't work for either of them, so months later they set for divorce, and in 1978 Jeff's parents had divorced. Jeff's dad thought it would be the best if he like moved out of the home, and so he goes to live in a motel for a while. And the mother, Joyce, she actually gets awarded custody for her youngest son David, and then she leaves the family house along with David and she moves in to her parents. That same year, still in 1978, in the month of May, Jeff actually graduates from Revere High School, and at that short period of time Jeff was at the family home all by himself, and it becomes very worrying. 3 weeks after graduation, on June 18th, 1978, after having turned 18 years old, Jeffrey was now considered legally an adult, and so as I told you, he is like living on his own right now, and because his parents had divorced and they had eventually just moved away. And he said in quotation to the Inside in 1993 later on, "I was coming back from the shopping mall back in 78. I'd had fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker and taking him back to the house and having complete dominance and control over him." This hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, was an 18-year-old guy on his way to a concert, and he apparently stood on the side of the road waiting for someone to stop and pick him up. Remember, according to Jeff, he had a similar dream about picking up a hitchhiker, and now that this really was happening, it kind of like aligned with everything in front of his eyes. Unexpectedly, this was like not at all calculated, and it was not like planned beforehand. On top of that, Jeff found this hitchhiker attractive as he would imagine him, and you know, now when he didn't have his parents inside his home, he was basically alone, so he could do whatever he wanted to. So Jeff pulls over and asks the hitchhiker like, "Hey, do you want to come over to my place? I have a few beers, I can like invite you and we could just hang out, like no kind of big deal type of way, you know what I mean?" And he hops on and Jeff like takes him. So they goes to Jeffrey's house, they start drinking, smoke some marijuana, and they listen to music. And I guess it became late, so later on Steven came to a point where he had to go. This made obviously Jeff become upset because he was, you know, not gay, Steven, and he was not simply interested in Jeffrey. So this kind of like, you know, made him very, very upset about this. And I just wish he would just let him go. When Steven is sitting on the bed, Jeff actually grabs a 10-pound dumbbell and just hits him hard twice from behind with it, and he hits his head, of course, and now laying on the ground bleeding a lot. Steven was alive but unconscious, and what Jeffrey essentially starts doing is that he starts strangling Steven until he dies. The reoccurring fantasy had turned into a real nightmare, and now when the victim lay on the floor dead, he begins to remove all of his clothing. And according to Jeff, he said later on that he stood over the victim's body and started masturbating. It's so disgusting, I know. And according to Jeff himself, this was his first victim, and he was feeling all sort of ways, excited, aroused, stronger, you know, as a person. And the next day, Jeff had this dead body in his house, and now he's like, I have to get rid of this body, right? I can't just leave it alone here. So what he does is that he actually takes the hitchhiker's body down to the basement behind, and that is when he starts to dismember the whole body. After Jeff has dismembered the body and just, you know, taken apart every piece of it, he grabs a shovel, and in order just to, you know, start to dig a grave in his backyard. And that is when he would like later on put Stephen Hicks, and, you know, for years and years he would lay there down back in the basement and no one would know. However, days and weeks goes by, and Jeff decides that he wants to dig up the body again to cut it up some more. And so he takes a knife and he digs up the remains, and then he starts cutting the flesh from the bones. Remember when Jeffrey sat and had dinner with his family, and when he actually asked them what would happen if the bones of the chicken were to be placed in bleach solution? And so, well, his father had actually shown him how to dissolve flesh from the bones, and so he used this technique now. He got some acid and he soaks the body in this acid to try to get all of the flesh and the meat off the bones. He wanted to somehow keep them, so after that he flushes the acid solution down the toilet, that he then crushes up the bones to preserve them in the wooded area behind the family home. And so that was Jeffrey's first kill. Now around 6 weeks after this horrendous incident, Lionel, Jeff's father, had actually found a new fiancée, and her name was Sherry. And Jeffrey's father was now coming home with his new fiancée to check on Jeffrey to see how he was doing. And at this point, Jeff's father actually discovers that Jeff was living all alone by himself. He had thought that his ex and younger son David had lived with Jeffrey. Now after returning back, Jeff's father started suggesting that, you know, you need to do something productive, Jeffrey. And he ends up sending his son going to college, and that sounded very good. So he offers Jeff to pay for his, you know, education, and does that in advance. And Jeff ends up moving to Ohio State University and hoping to major in, you know, business. After only 3 months, Jeffrey drops out of university, and again the father is like trying to help his son, you know, to get a life. So he tries to find him another kind of purpose, right? So he comes up with this another idea to maybe go to enlist in the US Army, and Jeffrey agrees. And, you know, Lionel, he was thinking that that would be something very good for his son, you know, to be able to develop as a person. So Jeffrey doesn't argue, and he enlists in the US Army. And in the US Army, Jeff trained as a medical specialist in San Antonio, Texas, and then later on in July 1979 be deployed to West Germany, where he was there and he served as a combat medic. However, published reports stated in his first year of service as a quote, average or slightly above average soldier, end quote. Later on, 2 soldiers would actually attest to have been raped by Jeff during his time in the US Army. In 2010, years and years after everything, one stated that Jeff had repeatedly been raping him over a 17-month period while they both were deployed in Germany, while another soldier believed that he had been drugged and raped by Jeffrey in 1979. In the month of March 1981, however, Jeff unsurprisingly was discharged, and he was deemed unsuitable from the military, all because of his drinking abuse. Now when he could like have the freedom to travel wherever he wanted to, he obviously didn't want to go to his father's home, because he knew that his father again would have like tried to tell him to do another things, and he didn't like wanted to go and just see that he have failed him again. So he decided to just go wherever he wanted to. And where would you go? Well, As Jeffrey Dahmer, you would go to Florida, to Miami Beach, and that's what he heads to. He flies to Florida and finds work at a restaurant, renting a room in a motel nearby his local job. And now having a stable job, Jeffrey would constantly buy alcohol with his, income that he would like receive from the work. This obviously made Jeffrey get kicked out from the motel, all because he couldn't pay for the rent, because he kept just go out to the stores and buy liquor and alcohol, and that obviously made it difficult to pay the rent. So he get kicked out. This kind of left him very empty and he had nowhere to go. So he ends up, calling his father and asking him, hey, can I come over? I need to come home. So he flies back to his home. He moved back to Ohio to his father and his new stepmother Sherry now, and still Jeffrey's father wouldn't give up, to continue to push his son to, stay busy by giving him different things to do around the house, and besides go and look for a job. During this time, Jeff was still drinking and his bedroom floor was like essentially covered with empty bottles, and he would actually be arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, and he was fined with like $60 and a 10-day jail suspension sentence. And now, after this incident, Jeff's father was angry and he had enough. He decided to send Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in West Allis in Wisconsin. And Jeff's grandmother was like the only individual of any family member that like showed love and appreciation to Jeffrey, so he kind of loved her very, very much. Staying in his grandma's place, he kind of changed things a little bit and he seemed at least to be a little bit more happier. He started to go to church with her, and he found a little bit of peace there, and whenever she needed help he would like help her. So he really helped his grandmother and he found a little peace there. And during this time, Jeff also found a job at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center, and in 10 months he kept working in the center until he got fired, so he like remained unemployed for 2 years. 1985, Jeffrey had started to visit local gay bathhouses, and when he would go there, obviously he would have intercourse with different men working there. And later on, Jeff would actually say that he would become very frustrated because he didn't want his partner to talk. He mumbled too much and he just wanted to have sex, he just wanted him to keep quiet essentially. Jeff didn't like that at all, and he wanted, just shut up and let me have sex with you. So he could just have told them that, right? That was the most easiest thing he could do. But instead, Jeffrey chose the easier part. He would actually crush a bunch of sleeping pills into the male's drink. But instead, Jeff would put crushed pills inside their drinks, and he would sneak the drinks inside with him. So this obviously knocked the victims out for hours. While they were knocked out for, the X amount of hours, Jeff would actually rape them. It was sad that Jeff did this 12 different times, and then he eventually, the owners just found that out and they kicked him out. They revoked his membership and just like banned him from coming at all. Just a note, why didn't they just call the police? That would be very, very easy, right? Who knows why? Maybe because they were gay. At that time it was not that accepted. So, and now instead of being angry and upset about this that had happened, Jeff is like, I don't give an F. He's like, now I have experience, let's just do it on my own. 25-year-old Stephen Toomey was actually picked up by Jeff after, meeting him at a gay bar at 219 on 20th of November 1987. And Jeff had asked him if he wanted to go with him to the hotel and stay with him and have some drink, chill and just hang out. Later on, Jeffrey recalled that he had absolutely 100% no intention of killing Toomey, but he intended to only drug him and rape him. It sounds so like the only fact that I'm smiling is because it's so fucked up, I'm just shocked by this. The next morning, however, after Jeffrey had invited him to his place at the Ambassador Hotel, he had woken up and he wakes up and Jeffrey sees that Stephen was beneath him laying. So essentially Jeffrey was, laying on him. His chest was crushed and it was blue and black. He had bruises all over his face and there was like a lot of blood coming out of his mouth. One of Jeffrey's forearm and fist were both covered in bruises. And Jeff told investigators later on that he just, quote, could not believe that this had happened, end quote. And it's like he tried to say that he didn't have any memory of this whatsoever. So waking up to this surprising scene, Jeff is like, damn, I need to get rid of this body. I can't just leave it here. So what he actually does is head out to a nearby store and he buys a large suitcase where he puts the body of the victim. And Jeffrey Loki takes the suitcase then back to his grandma's house where he puts it aside, and unopened for about a week, he decides to open it up and starts to dismember the body. He sliced the legs and the arms from the torso and severed the head to then cut the flesh from the bones of the body into a bunch of different pieces. Jeffrey then places the flesh into garbage bags and wrapped the bones in paper in order for the bones, to like no go anywhere. And then he later on used a sledgehammer to crush down the bones instinctively. Keep in mind that Jeff is doing this all down in his basement of his grandma's, so he's like, I gotta get rid of this, and everything remained without the head. He keeps the head and he puts everything in the trash. 2 weeks had gone by and Jeff took the head of Stephen Toomey. His only thought on his mind was that he wanted to keep the skull and he just wanted to clean the meat out of it and just to keep a skull, So in order to do that, he had used the skills that his dad, remember when I told you, had taught him, and he dissolved this in order to like retain the skull using a mix of soil eggs and bleach. So he does that, and the meat goes off, and he boils some water, and then he adds this dissolving acid together. Now guess what? Jeffrey was very angry because the bleach had failed him and it had made like the skull of the victim very brittle, so it kind of fell apart, and this made him just throw the skull away, and it didn't work. This did not strike Jeffrey, and he kind of like loved this new lifestyle of him, killing people, this passion. So he ends up continuing, and he seeks a lot of people constantly around bars or close to gay bars. He would come forward to them in the bars and he would start telling lies to them to make them seem comfortable, and they would like follow him home. He would drug them, and then he would have sex relations with these people, and then shit would happen. With other words, he would rape them, but also he would strangle them in the end. However, 2 months later, on January 16th, 1988, 14-year-old James Doxtator, a Native American sex worker, this boy was surely being trafficked, and it's so awful to even say that he was only 14 years old. However, he comes across Jeffrey, and when he comes up in the bar, he's like, hey, do you want to pose for nude pictures? I'll pay you $50 and you don't have to have sex with me. I need a model and I think you'd be perfect, And so the boy agrees for $50. He's like, hell yeah, why not? And they go back to Jeffrey's grandma's house and they have sex there, and Jeffrey ends up drugging the poor boy. Jeffrey had put a lot of crushed sleeping pills inside Doxtator's drink and then offered him, to drink it, and he just waited for him to pass. And after the boy passes out, Jeffrey obviously do his thing. He strangles him to death, and then he starts to dismember the victim's corpse. The victim's corpse then laid in the basement for a period of a week, and then Jeffrey dismembers it and he threw the body in the trash. Except again for his skull. Jeffrey really wanted a skull, a trophy, and this time he failed again with the same thing as with the previous victim. The bones became too brittle and he had to again just throw away the skull angrily, and he was very, very angry. He was kind of experimenting, trying to find the right formula to keep certain parts from the body as souvenirs, and in this case here it was the skulls he really wanted. This same period of time his probation ends. He got from drugging the men at the gay bathhouses that he used to visit. On March 24th, 1988, Jeffrey meets 22-year-old Richard Guerrero, and he meets him outside of a gay bar, and he comes up to him and he says like, hey, I give you $50 if you just come out and hang with me for the remainder of the night. And Richard agrees, and he goes with Jeffrey to his grandmother's house. There, Jeffrey drugs him with sleeping pills and he passes out and he gets strangled with a leather strap. Jeffrey performs oral sex on this body, as Jeffrey had decided to later on, within 24 hours, dismember this body of Richard. This time Jeffrey was more and more experienced, and he did it very quickly than the two previous ones. Once again, disposing the bones, he crushed them up and he put them in the trash along with the guy's skull. It's very surprising, right? Why would he keep the skull? He loved the skulls, right? But well, it turned out, according to Jeffrey, he simply crushed the skull, according to himself, and threw it away, all because he did not find this guy Richard to be very attractive, and so that's why he didn't keep the skull. Another young man is lured on April 23rd to Jeffrey's grandma's house, but But this time, after Jeffrey had like drugged this young boy's coffee and was about to do what he was, you know, always doing, he kind of hears his grandma's yelling, and she's like calling on Jeffrey. Hey Jeffrey, is that you? Jeffrey panics, and even though he's panicking from the inside, he's able to play it off as if he was by himself. And the tricky part is that Jeffrey's grandma knew that someone was in there, so now Jeffrey was like, fuck, I can't kill this guy, I need to drop him off. And so that is what he do. He takes this guy unconscious and drives him to the county general hospital, and then he drop him off to leave, and unharmed, thankfully he survives. He's very lucky, and I feel so good that he made it. Jeffrey comes back home and he's thankful that he did not get caught after leaving this boy. But fast forward to September 1988, Jeff's grandmother had enough, and she kicks him out of the house, all because of this habit that he had when he would always bring young men late night to the house. And besides that, Jeffrey's grandmother also complained a lot about the constant foul smells that was coming from both the basement and the garage. So now she couldn't take it anymore, and she was like, you gotta move out here, Jeffrey. So that's what Jeffrey ends up. He ends up moving out and finding a one-bedroom apartment, and the next day, you know, he ends up getting arrested. Jeffrey had drugged a 13-year-old boy, and he had sexually touched this boy, kissed his stomach, and touched the body's penis by first taking 2 Polaroid pictures. In 1989, on January, Jeffrey was convicted of second-degree sexual assault and of enticing a child for immoral purposes, but the sentencing for assault was suspended until May of 1989, and so that was a few months later. After ending up getting caught and arrested, Jeff moves back to his grandma's house, and this is like also the same time when he would meet a 24-year-old model, Anthony Sars, at a gay bar on March 25th, 1989. Keep in mind that this is the 5th victim, and he comes up shortly before the bar is about to close, and he starts talking to Jeffrey. Again, Jeffrey later recalled that he was not looking to commit a crime, but it just happened, you know, it just happened. And however, Jeffrey asks him if he wants to go back to his grandma's house and hang out, and they do so, and they both have oral sex together, and then Jeffrey drugged him and strangles him to death. And the next day in the morning, Jeff places the corpse in his grandmother's bathtub, where he decapitates the body before trying to take the meat off the bones. However, he strips the flesh from the body, and he crushes up the bones, and again throws it in the trash by only keeping the skull. According to Jeff, he found Anthony, quote, exceptionally attractive, end quote. And this was the first victim he permanently, you know, kept any body part of, you know, without like ending up to having crushed the skull. So he actually preserved that skull. He also preserved the lower region, like the penis, and he put it in acetone and stored them in his work locker. The following year, Jeffrey moves to an apartment, and he takes the skull of his victim with him. And the reason Jeffrey this time had moved away to the apartment is simply because he had gotten a job prior to his arrest at a chocolate factory. He was making his own money, and that's how he was able to move on his own. Also, the sexual stuff he did with that 13-year-old boy, remember, and when he got caught for, well, the sentencing was postponed until May 23rd, 1989. And Jeff receives a 5 years probation, but he had a work release permit, and so that made him still be able to work. And he also had to register as a sex offender, but still the nightmares were not over. Jeffrey moved to North 25th Street in Milwaukee on May 1990 to his own apartment now, and he worked at a nearby workplace in the chocolate factory again. And this area in that street was known for having a high crime rate, but obviously this was like no problem for Jeff. I mean, he was the crime, you know. However, the apartment was $300 per month, and it was all furnished and all, and it just needed someone to like stay there and live there with it, you know. Now Jeff gets his 6th victim, 32-year-old sex worker Raymond Smith. He had been lured in the same way with the promise of $50 for sex, and obviously you can't forget that. He laced him with sleeping pills as usual, and then he strangles him. The next day, a Polaroid camera was bought by Jeffrey, and he takes some pictures of the victim body by moving him around in different positions to take the best fitting pictures. And then after that, he actually dismembers Smith, and he boils his arms, legs, pelvis in a steel kettle, and then the bones in his sink. Then he puts the rest of the dissolved skeleton in a container filled with acid. Later on, Jeffrey, as before, spray painted this skull, and he placed it actually alongside the previous one, and he put it inside a meal filling cabinet. Jeffrey lured 27-year-old Edward, or Eddie Smith, to his apartment. Same thing, he drugs him, strangles him, he places the victim's skeleton in his freezer for months in hope that it would not retain moisture. He freezes the skeleton and it didn't remove any moisture, and the skeleton of his victim would be put in acid. Several months later, by accident, Jeffrey destroys the skull, and that was all because he had placed it into the oven as, very dry, and so the skull exploded. On September 2nd, 1990, 22-year-old Ernst Miller from Chicago agreed to come up with Jeffrey to his apartment, and Jeffrey says, the same thing as usual, I'll give you $50 if you come out and hang out with me, and blah blah blah. The victim agrees, and when they go to Jeffrey's place, Jeffrey had attempted to perform oral sex on Miller, but Miller had informed him, saying in quote, "That will cost you extra," end quote. This made Jeff pissed off, obviously, and the problem was now that he only had 2 sleeping pills, and he knew that wouldn't knock him out for hours, so he wouldn't be able to do what he wanted with him. So instead of knocking him out, he actually cuts his throat and let him bleed to his death. After that, Jeffrey takes his polar camera that he had gotten and starts moving Miller's body to pose him for pictures, and then he places Miller in his bathtub for dismemberment. While the body was in the bathtub, Jeffrey had recalled saying that he repeatedly kissed and talked to the severed head while he dismembered the remainder of the body. He wraps the biceps, the heart, and portions of his victim's flesh from his legs in plastic bags, and then he places them in the fridge for later consumption. Jeff boiled the remaining flesh and organs into a coach jelly-like substance using again soil eggs. That chemical cleaner that would help him get the flesh off of the bones. On September 24th, 1990, Jeffrey had lured 23-year-old Dave Thomas, which he was not at all, according to himself, attracted to. Instead of, keeping any body parts, aka the skull, he only photographed the dismemberment process, and then he threw the remains completely. 19-year-old Errol Lindsay had met Jeffrey by chance on the street, and he was going to walk to get his key cut, and so Jeffrey sees Lindsay and he starts asking him, "Hey, you want to come over to my apartment and just hang out?" And Errol agrees, and he takes him home, and he actually drugs him. But this time it's actually very different, because this time Jeffrey actually drills a hole inside the victim's skull, a hole, and then he pours hydrochloric acid into it. The victim is not yet dead, and he was only knocked out from the drugs while drilling a hole into his skull. And when Errol woke up, Jeffrey actually recalled him saying in quote, "I have a headache, what time is it?" end quote. Jeffrey was excited now, because his only intention by doing all of this was actually to create a living zombie. He wanted to have a permanent, unresistant male partner that just would obey everything Jeffrey would tell him to do. So that was kind of the whole purpose of this. So in response to that, Jeffrey actually strangles Errol because he needed to go back to bed. He needs to be decapitated, and he retains the skull. The hard question, I think, is why would he kill him? This feeling of having control of someone, that is what he wanted, so why would he even bother to kill him? This time, however, as I told you, Jeff wanted to keep the skull because it had a hole through, and for that he uses cold water and a little bit of salt in the water for weeks to let it soak, and hopes to permanently keep it, but it doesn't work, so he throws it away. In 1991, there was actually constant complaints to the manager by fellow residents that lived in the apartments where Jeffrey lived in about foul smells that was coming from Jeffrey, and the neighbors also complained that there was sounds of falling objects and occasionally a chainsaw. So they call the manager and tells him that, and the manager actually doesn't go up to Jeff. I don't know why he didn't do it. He should really have got up, but anyways, I don't think it would be suitable because of his safety, but you know what I mean. And instead he calls him and he says hey, other people are complaining that there's a smell coming from your place. And Jeffrey is yeah, well, my freezer is broken and all the food inside of it just became spoiled, and that's why they are smelling this. And the manager's reaction is soft, and he's oh, okay, just get that cleared up, and people are complaining. And then he's blah blah blah, and then hangs up the phone. Between a week and two goes by and Jeffrey receives another call from the manager again, and he says, hey, so your neighbors are still complaining that there is smell coming from your apartment? Like, I thought you had cleared this up, you know? What Jeffrey responds and says is, oh my god, you don't understand, like several of my tropical fishes had died and it's causing this horrendous smell, and that's what it is. And then the manager says, okay, just get it fixed up. What about that chainsaw? And Jeffrey's like, what chainsaw? And then the manager just hangs up. On May 26, 1991, on an afternoon, Jeffrey encountered 14-year-old boy Conrad Sintasaphone, and he coerced him to his apartment, offering, you know, money to hang out. According to Jeff, this little boy was reluctant, but then somehow like went with it and hung with him, probably because he felt pushed by Jeffrey. The boy poses for pictures and then Jeff drugged him. The poor boy then passes out, and Jeffrey, now getting creative, takes the drill and drills a single hole into the victim's skull, and then he injects hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe. Conrad was technically still alive, and so when he had led this boy into his bedroom, Conrad passes out of panic, but then he gets dizzy and falls unconscious because he sees another body that was laying naked on the floor. That body belonged to 31-year-old deaf-mute Tony Hoods, because he had also been strangled by Jeffrey 3 days earlier. However, Jeffrey is drinking beer while Conrad is laying there unconscious next to him, and for some reason Jeffrey leaves the apartment and goes to a local bar to have a drink, and then he pushes extra alcohol, and then when he comes back and is about to arrive to his home, it's like early in the morning, and I don't know why he left though. He's coming back and he's heading home, and that is when he sees Conrad. The 14-year-old boy that was upstairs in his home was now outside naked on the corner of the street, and beside him there was 3 young women, and they were asking him like, hey, are you okay boy, what's the matter, hello, and you know, they were trying to check on him basically, but the poor boy couldn't answer, and you know, he couldn't overthink either because he was literally paralyzed, and you know, he was drugged too, so they are still trying to get some answer from him. And now Jeffrey sees this and he's like, oh shit, I gotta stop this right now. So he goes up to these 3 young women and he's like, oh my god, this is my friend, he's drunk, don't worry, I'm just going to, you know, take him up to my apartment again. And now when Jeffrey is trying to take the boy back to his apartment, well, this woman had already called 911, so they could resist and patiently waited for the police. So that delayed Jeffrey, and he was very like panicking right now, and according to the woman, they had a gut feeling of something being wrong with this. However, the police finally arrived, and Jeffrey tells that this young boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend and that he only drank too much alcohol and he should be fine, you know. And the police seemed to be numb and didn't like question Jeffrey, and one of the women who had called 911 was like, no, this is not right, you have to do something here. So she does is that she actually pulled an officer aside, and she starts telling him that this is like wrong. You see, this man was like bleeding from the back of his butt. So the officers ends up covering the back of the young boy with a towel, and obviously poor Conrad was struggling, and Jeff was just trying to get him back to his apartment, and the officer told that woman to quote, butt out, shut the hell up and do not interfere, and end quote. Police officer said, this is between them, it's not your problem, and you don't worry about it, you know. However, they walk Jeffrey and the young boy to the apartment, and while doing so, Jeffrey is still mumbling about that this young man was his boyfriend, and he's trying to prove that by showing them Polaroid pictures of Conrad, you know, the nude pictures of him that he had taken. And Jeffrey is like, see, it's my boyfriend, he let me take these sexy pictures of him, like, you know, I know him. So the stupid police officers actually believe Jeffrey's manipulations, and they tell him to take good care of his lover, and then they just head out from the apartment. Jeff once again injects hydrochloric acid into Conrad's brain, and you know, this time the poor boy dies. I mean, he could have been saved, you know, but the cops was very ignorant. And the following day after killing Conrad, Jeffrey actually calls out of work and he tells him that he is like sick, because remember, he had one body and now a second, so he wanted like to take care of them and dedicate his day to like dismember the bodies. 3 more men would be lured and dismembered in the same way as his like previous victims, and eventually Jeff would get fired from his job at the factory, all because he would like called out so much that he was not be able to come, and so he gets fired from his job, and he said that it made him kill and dismember another victim. However, on July 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey had offered $100 to 3 men he had approached in a bar to accompany him to his apartment and to drink some beer and to pose for some nude photographs, and one of the 3 men only agreed. The 2 men didn't go for some reason, and that is 32-year-old Tracy Edwards. He follows Jeffrey, and directly when Tracy walks in the door, he gets a whiff of just like a foul smell. He felt the smell that that Conrad had felt, and he also at the same time notices several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor. Tracy is obviously like surprised, like, bro, what the fuck is this? Like what is this all about? And Jeffrey tells him like, oh, I use it to clean bricks. However, they both go to Jeffrey's bedroom, and inside there was a 57-gallon drum standing in the corner, and Tracy said that this smell definitely was coming from this drum that was standing in the corner. What Jeff then does is actually placing his head kind of in a loving way on Tracy's chest, and it wasn't loving at all, or not romantically at all, because instead he was holding out a knife. Jeff speaks out and says, I'm going to rip your heart out, and Tracy's like, what the fuck, man? And he starts freaking out because at this point Tracy has understood that Jeff is about to do something to him. He's like, this monster is going to rip my heart out. I gotta get out. There's no chance that I'm going to survive this. Now he tries to collect himself and, to not let Jeffrey be suspicious, and he starts kind of looking for ways to escape, and he thinks of windows because there was windows around, so he thought, well, I could try and jump out of a window. So he thinks of all the possible ways, and maybe he thinks, oh, I can go to the bathroom. So he does that. He asks Jeffrey in a polite manner, like, may I use your restroom please? And he goes in, but there is no window there, so he's like, fuck, I'm fucked. So he comes back to the living room. Now when they're hanging in the living room, Tracy's like, again, can I use your bathroom? He goes back to the bathroom. Now at this point he returns from the bathroom, and he sees that Jeff isn't fully paying attention, so he punches him in the face as hard as he can and then runs out of the front door. At 11:30 p.m. Tracy Edwards flagged 2 police officers, and he told them like, hey, there is this dude that tried to fucking attack me. There is some fucking weird ass shit going over there. You should really come over with me. And he had been handcuffed also on the wrist when he had come down and found these police officers. Also a side reminder is that when Tracy at some point when he sat in Jeffrey's home, he wasn't paying attention, and that was also the same exact time where Jeffrey had placed a handcuff on Tracy's wrist. And when that had happened, Tracy was like, what the crap are you doing? And so Jeffrey answering him by saying, well, I thought we could hang out. So now when he ran out to the cops, he was still wearing the handcuffs, so that also made it easier for the cops to realize that something was happening. So he tells the police to come up, and he shows them the handcuff, and obviously they agrees, and they come up with him, and they try first to actually use their own keys, but it didn't work and the keys didn't fit. However, they follow Tracy to Jeff's apartment, and they arrive to Jeff, and Jeff invites the police officers along with Tracy, and Jeff acknowledges that he had placed the handcuffs on Tracy, but he never actually showed an explanation to why he did that. Jeff tells the officers that the key to the handcuffs was inside his bedroom dresser, so they walked in the bedroom, and Jeff is trying to box him out, like, I'll get the key, he don't want them to get in there. So obviously the cops becomes angry, and he's like, get out of the way. And when the police steps in advance, he sees the dresser drawer opened, and inside there was a lot of Polaroid pictures, many of which were human bodies in various stages of dismemberment. When the police officers look at the backgrounds of these pictures, he realized that they had all been taken here where they were standing. And so he goes out to his partner into the living room, and when Jeffrey sees that, he's like, oh fuck, I'm fucked now. And the police officer is holding several of the Polaroids, and he starts getting angry, because they are about to handcuff him, and so they put the handcuffs on him. At this point it's almost over for Jeff, because one of these officers opens actually up the fridge and sees a severed head of a male on the bottom shelf. They continue and do a detailed search of the apartment and find 4 severed heads in the kitchen. A total of 7 skulls are found, and some were painted. Some were also found in Jeffrey's bedroom inside a closet. There were skulls and body parts that were outspread in random places at every corner. The cops also found 2 human hearts and a portion of an arm muscle, each wrapped inside a plastic bag in the bottom shelf of the fridge. Investigators also found an entire torso plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom of the freezer. Through the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified skull in the 57-gallon drum. Remember, it was in the bedroom. There inside they found 3 further dismembered torsos were dissolving in acid solution, and 74 in total of Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of Jeffrey's victims were found. Finally, Jeffrey was arrested on July 23, 1991. Sitting in prison, he was later brought in for questioning. They bring him in and ask him why he did this. Jeffrey admits to investigators to have murdered 16 young men, plus Stephen Hicks later on, which he was only 18 years old. He had killed these young men in Wisconsin since 1987, and on January 13, 1992, his trial began for the 15 counts of first-degree murder. The trial had lasted for 2 weeks, and Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 70 years. Jeffrey was going now to spend the rest of his life in prison because death penalty was abolished in Wisconsin in 1853. The first year of his sentence, Jeff had actually spent it through solitary confinement due to the concerns amongst his fellow inmates. Jeffrey was now famous, he had people trading him, people wanted him dead, but he had also those who felt sympathy for Jeffrey. However, on the morning of November 28th, 1994, Jeff was found on the floor on one of the bedroom of the gym, suffering from head and facial wounds. He had been beaten in the face and head with a 20-inch metal bar, kind of the same way as he did towards, his first victim. So he got it back there. His face had been slammed against the wall during this assault, and when he was found, he was still alive. They rushed him to a nearby hospital, but he didn't make it, and he was pronounced dead 1 hour later. The attacker of this fellow was Christopher Scarver, who was serving a life sentence. He said that he, the killer, Jeffrey, and then another inmate were cleaning the staff locker room together. And normally an officer, watches you to make sure nothing like this happens, but for a split second, an officer left, and I think, probably he was on this whole thing. It's just to kill Jeffrey, I think. According to Scarver, when he hit Jeffrey in the head, he didn't make any noise, he didn't say anything, he didn't cry, he didn't flinch, and when they asked the inmate why he did it, he said, "God told me to do it." This inmate also killed another inmate who was cleaning with them, again saying that God needed him to do it. And Jeffrey's mother passed away in year 2000, his father retired, his younger brother David, remember, he changed his whole identity. In the end, I feel sorry for every victim that was killed at the hands of this monstrous man, and I hope their relatives one day can, after all this year, hopefully find peace. This was all for today, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to show your support, and I love you so much. Peace and thank you.